welcome to the Check-In 99. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming. This is an opportunity to listen to John Gartland.
Yeah.
Thanks for all coming. This is an event,
Very
a
serious
literary
faces,
event
which are
in,
just right.
The Check-In 99. The Check-In 99 has been a place for a few years now where there's cauldrons of creativity bubbling away in all corners, every nook and cranny of this old establishment, this old bordello. So it's great to have you all here today, or tonight even. And what is going to happen now, we have two writers in the house, one of which is a traveling crime fiction blogger. Mr. Peter Brzozowski is going to be talking about his travels. He traveled to over 25 different countries, writing about crime fiction all across the globe. And we have our own resident crime fiction writer, Mr. Christopher G. Moore. Christopher has written he's written I think 35 books now, 35 novel-length works, and gets better with each one. He's won awards in Germany, in Spain. He won the Shamus for the first paperback edition of Asia Hand. A real international guy. Christopher, can you meet your audience?
Yeah. Okay.
Put your hands together, guys.
Yeah.
And Christopher's going to be hosting the event. He's going to be asking the all-important questions. And on the receiving end is Mr. Peter, who's manfully walking over to the stage as we speak here. Put your hands together for Peter Brzozowski. And now I hand you over to my hostess with the mostest, Mr. Christopher G. Moore.
Thank you, James, for that introduction. And I'm very pleased to see a very good turnout. See a lot of friends in the audience, see a lot of writers in the audience, some of the top critics and who write about writers in the audience here as well. So it's good to see this community to come together for an event like this. And I think we're very fortunate today to have Peter with us. I met Peter for the first time when I started going to the Bouchercon Crime Mystery Festival in the United States. It's the biggest convention, and we got to know each other over dinner and lunch when we were in San Francisco in 2010. And Peter has been going to Bouchercon for, I think, for the last 7 or 8 years, and is one of the personalities of that convention. He usually is on at least a couple of panels and moderates panels very well. So he is someone who knows a lot about the crime fiction community, the authors, the editors, and publishers, and agents, and other people who come together at these conventions. So he has a wealth of information, I think, to share with us. So the format, I'm going to keep it informal. I'm going to ask Peter some questions and see if we can get a reaction from him. And at the same time, I want to leave time for people to be able to ask their own questions of Peter in terms of everything from how can I become a crime fiction writer and sell my stuff in the United States to what computer program should I use, not everything in between. So I think I'd like to maybe start by asking Peter to provide us a little background in terms of, is there value for authors to attend conventions or festivals like Bouchercon or Crime Fest in order to meet other writers, to meet editors, to exchange information? What's the value that you see in that after your 8-year experience?
Well, I don't write fiction myself, but I have to think that with publishing the way it is today, not an easy market to break into, that a forum where you can meet people and get people to know your books, that has to be valuable. So that's what I would see as the value to BoucherCon. So I mean, Christopher met me. So I'm a guy who's writing about books. I'll write about his books now. You get your name out there. Maybe more than meeting the publishers, agents, and editors. It's a way to get your name out there.
I think it's a good point, is that social media, I take it, is quite important now in terms of marketing and promotion of books in the crime fiction community?
I don't know if it is. I mean, I have a fairly active social media presence myself, but it's, I have to think if I were an author, I don't know how big a part I would make that of my presence, because it's just so easy for it to turn into white noise.
In terms of people coming from abroad to the United States, what kind of reception is that? Or
You mean at conventions?
yeah,
or-
conventions like at BoucherCon.
Oh, well, I was telling Christopher last night, I think the presence of, well, from what my North American point of view is international crime fiction. I think it is gradually increasing at the American conventions. I think it was actually the year before I met Christopher, I moderated what may have been the first international crime fiction panel at a BoucherCon, and I think it was just an international crime fiction panel. And in succeeding years, there might be 2 or 3 of those panels. Plus, I mean, last year I moderated a panel on Northern Ireland crime fiction. And this year someone else did a panel on Canadian crime fiction. And this sort of thing is in addition to the generic international crime fiction panels. So I would say the way BoucherCon is set up, the people who get on the panels are authors who register, just like regular fans. So if you folks want to increase the presence of crime fiction from your part of the world, just sign up for the conventions, and then people like me who moderate the panels. I mean, if I say I want to moderate a panel on crime fiction in Southeast Asia, well, that does no good unless you folks are registered. If I can say, well, we're going to get 5, 6 of these people registering, so I don't have to do anything, you guys do.
That's a nice segue, I think, into the question about cross-cultural crime fiction and the cross-cultural detectives that occupy a fair amount of the crime fiction. I had a question from Dr. Tom Hoy, who teaches at Thomasat, and he basically was saying, ask Peter about, is there any other place in the world where you would have, for example, an Asian detective or a Thai detective solving crimes and writing about the culture in his own language? Because that's, in a sense, what we're doing here. Is there are certainly people who write who are other than native English speakers, but that seems to be kind of a predominant part of the crime fiction, international fiction here. You have Tim Hallinan, John Burdett, James Newman's got a series here, set here. Colin Pipperell has written a number of very good books set here, who's also a fellow Canadian. And so we have, in a sense, set up this notion of an expat presence inside of a crime fiction world, and those detectives explore and communicate inside the expat world as well as the Thai world in which it exists. Is there any other place that you know of that has something equivalent to that?
I don't know if there is or not, and we were talking about this last night, and the roots of it go back to hundreds of years. Who were the people who went exploring other cultures, who went colonizing other cultures? who, in more recent centuries, had the money and the leisure to be able to go and explore other cultures. Well, it was people, by and large, of Western European descent, and of course, other cultures had their great explorers, but that all died out before the age of exploration, before publishing, before the age of mass media. So what will happen is, in order to have the phenomenon about which you were asking, we'll have to wait for the United States to complete its slippage into third world status, and for, let's say, Chinese and Russian writers to be the ones who were traveling abroad. And it would be kind of nice to think of America and Western Europe as something exotic. I mean, it would be easy to do that. Anyone in this room could do that from an ironic point of view, but from an unironic point of view, I just hope I'm still alive and in full possession of my mental faculties when that happens. It'll be fun.
So the idea of an ethnic Thai, native-speaking Thai, private eye, operating in Manhattan, you think is going to be on the cards?
Well, I mean, I think you talked about what the butterfly effect. We don't know what could happen. And anything you could think of, all it takes is one ethnic Thai writer to wind up in Manhattan and write a book. But for it to happen on any kind of a mass scale, on anything like what happens with American and European crime fiction, it will take a while. It will be a momentous change when that happens.
I think another feature of the crime writing that is part of this community in Thailand is the notion of outsider insider. We discussed this a little bit last night. Is that most fiction is written by insiders for insiders. Even if you have someone who appears to be an outsider, I'm thinking like Lee Child's Jack Reacher. I mean, Jack Reacher is an American, but he still is an insider. So people can relate to the fact he looks like me, he sounds like me, and basically has a background similar to me. And that there are a lot of crime fiction readers that seem to want books that in some ways are a mirror of their own life, but exaggerated with a certain level of risk and adventure that makes them want to follow the story because that is me in the shoes of that character.
Sure, but I mean, readers don't know what they want until they get it.
Well, I think that's right. They don't really know, but on the other hand, you can kind of see what sells and what doesn't sell. And so from those kind of commercial statistics, you get an idea that some markets are larger than others. And really the market here is, for most of us in the room who write in English, we're outsiders inside a different kind of community. So we're interpreting a community which is not native to us in a language that's not native to us. And that's a different kind of writing and a different kind of perspective than you find in the typical crime fiction novel.
Sure, and we've talked about this, and maybe we can get to this later. I enjoy some of the, well, let's say not the strategy, but the tactics, some of those writers from outside who are based here that they adopt. But I have to think, I'm a reader, and maybe it's unfortunate in a way that it's not politic to talk about. We're not allowed to say anything is exotic anymore, but figure out, you writers who are based here, figure out a way to promote your books that screams exotic, but without being the opening theme to Hawaii Five-0. I mean, without being condescending and without descending to stereotypes. reclaim and rehabilitate the word exotic. That's what you people ought to do, because that's what I want to read.
Yeah. One of the things I think that came up at BouncerCon this year, and you'd mentioned it on your blog, and it has to do with someone writing who's an outsider, writing as an insider of a culture. In other words, there has been criticism. I can remember this happened to me years ago in British Columbia. I had written a play about the relocation of the Canadian Japanese for the CBC, and I can remember a fairly well-known personality who had been in one of the camps saying, "What right do you have to be writing about what happened to us in that camp?" And I mean, we have series here, like for example, I think Colin Cottrell's Dr. Siri series. I mean, he's writing about a Laotian forensic scientist in the 1970s, and you have John Burdett, a very good writer who's writing about a Luk Krung police officer, Song Chai. So, what are the views now for someone who is, in a sense, writing about someone of a different ethnic group, a different religion, different gender? It seems to be controversial in the States.
The example you mentioned, I wonder if that piker, that rank amateur, James Elroy, caught any flack for what he did in his most recent novel, Perfidia, which centers, the central event is the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, which that arch conservative, the white knight of the far right, James Elroy, I think he called the internment just one of the great tragedies of American history. So what does that mean? If you're going to step into another pair of cultural shoes, I mean, two things. Just strive, read Elroy's book, I mean, strive for that kind of empathy, and then say, I mean, screw the critics, the hell with them. Don't let them tell you what to write.
Okay. Something that you've written about on your blog as well is, and this is a quote from Braudel, A History of Civilization. Since the development of Greek thought, however, the tendency of Western civilization has been towards rationalism and hence away from religious life. But that's really a trademark of the West. In almost all other places outside of the West, you find the culture is submerged with religion, the supernatural, and magic. And there's certainly in this part of the world, a lot of the crime fiction does have those kind of elements, you know, mystical elements, and John Burdett again does this quite well in his book. Colin Cottrell does this well in his book, and I think Colin Pipperell has done this in some of his books as well. So this bringing of the supernatural into the crime fiction world, is this something that you'd like to talk about a little bit? I mean, is this done elsewhere with crime fiction books, international books that are set in other non-Western places?
I don't know. I mean, I do know there's the paranormal category, and there will be, if you come to VoucherCon, there'll be at least one panel on paranormal. There have been at least one crime novel out of southern Africa in which not so much, you don't have the supernatural invoked in the way Colin Cottrell does, but superstition of witch doctors, and the term slips my mind, but the kidnapping of people and the use of their body parts and magic comes up. So, I mean, maybe if the apprehension on the part of writers of Western, of European, or the apprehension is if I write about the supernatural, will I come across as colonizing and appropriating someone else's culture and all that crap? It was the writing team of Michael Stanley were the ones I just the team that I just alluded to. Think about that. Think about the Western rationalism. Think about the supernatural and make it your subject. What happens when the two collide, I think. Much trickier to project yourself into the supernatural.
Yeah.
What happens when the two collide? That's what I'm interested in reading.
Well, I think that's something that's in the fiction as well, particularly with people who are in the expat community and with the Thai community, where there's still a culture of spirit houses and lucky numbers, whether it's lottery numbers or lucky names.
Well, I mean, it's still there. It's still there in Western culture, but submerged. As you know, I spent the last few days in some not entirely developed parts of Cambodian countryside, and the Buddha shrines that you see in front of every second or third dwelling reminded me of nothing so much as what you see in Tuscany, hiking through the fields to go see Piero della Francesca's great fresco of the Madonna del Parto, the pregnant Madonna. It's out there. It's there in Western culture, but it's just submerged. Maybe we aren't all that different after all.
Yeah. I think maybe we're probably not that different, but it may be that the genre of crime fiction or international detective fiction is such that there is kind of maybe a genre limitation handed down from Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, which are more hard-boiled, where a mystical or supernatural part would seem not to be part of that tradition.
Well, I guess you mentioned Hammett. The Flitcraft parable in the Maltese Falcon. I mean, it's existential. What if the same thing? If the idea, I mean, what would be a Thai or a Cambodian version of the Flitcraft parable? I'm sure some of you are familiar. Go read it. It's one chapter in the Maltese Falcon, and that's your homework. I'll come back next year. I'll collect the assignments and rewrite or transfer that parable over to here. I bet it would not be that difficult. The body would be the same, but the conclusion would be different.
And that kind of leads me to the next question, is that orientation of how you orient a foreign audience, which would be the U.S. audience, to fiction that's set here in a way that is not a travelogue, but at the same time allows them to get their bearings within a very different culture.
First of all, you're shockingly politically incorrect. We're not supposed to say Orient. We're not supposed to say foreign. We have to figure out other ways to say those things. How do you do it? Well, don't ask me. You guys do it. Oh, I mean, a number of writers, Andrew Nettie and Tim Hallinan come to mind. They will write a series featuring protagonists who are, they've got one parent who's Asian, one who's European, that sort of thing. And I mentioned Andrew Nettie. I guess I don't know if Ghost Money was his first novel, but the protagonist has a woman who is looking for her brother. Now that's Raymond Chandler all the way. I mean, that's the little sister. Now I have no idea. I know Andrew. I don't know if he did that consciously, but it does bring up the idea that there are, in addition to Western expectations and Eastern expectations, there are genre expectations. So just find a way to come up with some sort of hook, something that someone who walks into a bookstore where books are classified by genre, give give the bookshop some reason to shelve that book in crime fiction, and once you've sucked them into it, you just do something weird with it.
Yeah. But this is your first trip to Thailand, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Has your orientation changed in terms of, you were planning for the trip, you've not been here, you probably did some reading, you had perceptions from movies, TV, novels you've read. What kind of orientation has changed inside of Peter's head since he's been here in terms of how you would understand what you've seen so far?
Oh, let's see, what time is it now? I've now been here probably a little over 24 hours, and you're asking me to...
Some people have been here 24 hours for 50 years.
Well, what I did say, I guess, I mean, I was, 9 years ago when I started writing about this crime fiction, I expressed some wariness of writers who let's say, their books were more full of local color than real life was. Meanwhile, before I'd been here an hour and a half in Bangkok, I compared it to Los Angeles, and then I compared it to Istanbul, and then I compared it to Midtown Manhattan, and that was all before I ever got to Soy Cowboy. So, I mean, ask me that when when I'm a grizzled Southeast Asia hand of 48 hours, but it's weird. It is I feel like it's a kaleidoscope and all that crap. But if someone had told me before I came here, oh, it's like a kaleidoscope, I would have rolled my eyes. But now I have a little more sympathy for authors whose books seem to me to be too much local color, because if someone put a gun to my head and said, write the first chapter of a novel by breakfast time tomorrow, it would be local color and clashing impressions.
In the anthology Phnom Penh Noir, one of the authors that seemed to catch your attention was Kosel Kev, who's, for those of you who are not familiar with Phnom Penh Noir, it's a collection of short stories as well as lyrics, and in the case of Kosel, is rap lyrics with biographical material inserted in between. And he had a very colorful background. He was born in an internment camp during the time of the Khmer Rouge. Ended up in the States as very, very young. Ended up in a gang. Was charged and convicted of a serious crime. And spent 14 years in an American prison before being deported back to Cambodia, a country which he had absolutely no knowledge of except from the Cambodian community in California where he lived. And so here you have someone who has been an outsider in almost every place he's lived. He was an outsider in the States. He's thrown back to Cambodia. He's an outsider in Cambodia. And from that, he was able to create some very powerful poetry to try to understand the kind of pain and suffering he personally had and the difficulties of adjusting to prison life and adjusting to Cambodia.
Well, the job is simple. All you have to do is find more authors with backgrounds as interesting as his. I don't know how good an example he is for anything, because his life and the piece that you collected in that anthology just break every kind of boundary. And you talked earlier about people getting flack for presuming to write about cultures other than their own. Well, what is his culture? What is his culture? The idea of the outsider is just, I mean, it's a cliche. There's nothing that can make you more of an insider than being an outsider. But this guy is a real outsider. I mean, anything you can say, outsider, rootless, man without a country, these are all tropes, tired ones. But this guy's life just gives new life to that. So you all should, well, you probably all do know him, maybe you all do. I don't know, he's just such a singular presence. I don't know what kind of an example he could be to other writers than anyone else.
But knowing Cosell, I think part of his lesson that he conveys is the utter passion and commitment he has to the art. I mean, he's not a dilettante. This is someone who saw this as the only way out of a very black, deep hole that he'd been buried in his entire life. I mean, he was someone, during the 14 years in prison, he had heard some other inmates talking about a poetry class. And so he asked if he could join, and he did. And from there, he learned from black Americans who were in prison about rap. And from rap and poetry, he was able to, in a sense, reinvent himself through art. And somehow I think it's that reinvention of someone who learned how to communicate in a prison, inside of a closed society where there's no freedom, no liberty, but an absolute burning desire to make something of their life.
Well, reinventing oneself, that's another one of those, maybe more recent but old tropes. So, you want to be like him? You want to do what this guy did? Christopher told you what kind of desperate straits he was in. You ask yourself, what can I do to get myself into straits that desperate? You don't want to do it. Is there, well, some form of deep meditation that you can imagine yourself into that sort of desperation? It would go very much to the roots of noir if you could do it. But imagine yourselves what would be the most desperate situation you could be in. Maybe that would be the inability to imagine desperation. It's the most desperate situation you could be in.
When you are at conventions, and you know a lot of writers, is it common for them to, in a sense, live the life that they're writing about? Or is it something that they sit in their ranch house in a suburb and invent out of a bottle or out of just a crazy imagination?
Crazy imagination. They're not like their characters. I don't know any writer who drinks as much as his or her characters. I think, because, look, writing, I've never written a novel, but I don't know that I've ever written anything longer than a novella. But to sit down and write 80,000 words and polish it, and that kind of sustained effort does not lend itself to dissipation and desperation. It doesn't, I take it on faith that it doesn't. You can't be dissipated and undisciplined and expect to see a novel with your name on it appear.
Two more questions, and then I want to open up for questions. The first of those two questions is, you've written in a comment about Canada is by reputation polite, progressive, civilized, and its crime writing has not had the international impact it deserves. Sweden, on the other hand, is by reputation polite, progressive, and civilized, and we all know what its crime writers have done. Why is this?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. One historical reason for Sweden's crime writing having been the way it is simply the advent of Maya Cheval and Père Valleux and the Martin Beck series. Yes, Sweden was a model social welfare state that has a seeming underbelly, but the same could be said of many other Western European countries. I mean, I've said for a long time that I think the best international crime fiction is coming out of Ireland, and in particular, Northern Ireland. I don't know. I try to come up with explanations, and it's just circular. I mean, there is a fine tradition of Irish writing. Well, the reason why there is a lot of terrific crime fiction coming out of Northern Ireland is that there's a lot of terrific crime writers in Northern Ireland. So I mean, why Stieg Larsson? I don't know. It is evidence that God does play dice with the universe.
But what is it about the Northern Ireland community and culture that is producing so many writers?
The only thing I can come up with it's a lot of some of the best Northern Ireland crime writers. They either set their writing during the sectarian troubles, or really even better, they write very sensitively of the ripple effect of these events, and that's one reason ghosts. We talked about the supernatural. Natural ghosts figure prominently in Northern Ireland crime fiction. I mean, the Troubles did not end with the Good Friday Accords. The Troubles did not end when the shooting stops. The effects keep rippling. But again, is that an explanation? I don't know, because any number of parts of the world have had upheavals even more traumatic than that, but they don't seem to be producing the kind of crime fiction that Northern Ireland does. There just happen to be a lot of good writers there. And that would be, I mean, Stuart Neville and Adrian McKinty are the two that I have in mind, and particularly McKinty's current series, and anything by Stuart Neville, really.
There was a recent article in the Guardian profiled Umberto Eco, and he had an interesting quote saying that literature really is literature about losers, and he quotes Madame Bovary and Hector in the Iliad as examples, and many, many other examples. And he went on to say that winners are stupid because usually they win by chance.
Well, that sounds like it could be a description of what's often thought to be a subset of crime fiction, and maybe is, but not entirely, noir fiction. Not all noir writing is crime, but that's, Umberto Eco doesn't strike me as a particularly noir type of guy, but that is, and David Goodis, who was the best or the second best noir writer who ever lived, I think has been called the poet of losers.
Nelson Algren, Chicago, would be another one in that category.
Nah, well, he's a bit of a poser. Anyone who carries on an affair with Simone de Beauvoir under the eyes of Jean-Paul Sartre cannot entirely be said to identify fully with losers.
He was no Bukowski, in other words.